All right, so get this picture. A historical thriller set in 1961 Cold Wars in full swing.
Oh, this is going to be good.
Our main character, Dag Hammarskjöld, the UN Secretary General, he's on this mission to bring peace to a newly independent Congo.
Sounds pretty straightforward.
Right? You'd think so.
Yeah.
Except he never makes it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
This is where it gets interesting.
This is one of those deep dives where you're going to walk away with more questions than answers. We're digging into Susan Williams's book, Who Killed Hammarskjöld? It dives into the mystery surrounding his death. And to help us unpack all of this, we've got an expert with us today who can hopefully shed some light on what went down.
Well, I'll do my best. It's a complicated case.
So before we get into the theories and conspiracies, because trust me, there are plenty, let's start with what we think we know. You ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Let's set the scene.
Perfect. Now, this wasn't just some routine diplomatic trip. Hammarskjöld was walking into a total powder keg. What was going on in the Congo at the time? Why was the UN Secretary General even there in the first place?
It was a turbulent time. The Congo had just gained its independence from Belgium in 1960.
Right.
But things were far from stable. Imagine different factions all vying for control.
Oh, wow.
A country on the brink of civil war. Hammarskjöld, a huge advocate for African independence, was determined to mediate and help them find peace.
A noble goal, for sure, but also incredibly dangerous, especially with the Cold War adding fuel to the fire.
Exactly. You have to remember the global context here. The Cold War wasn't just about the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It was playing out all over the world. And Africa was a key battleground. Hammarskjöld's vision of a truly independent Africa free from any kind of colonial influence was a threat to the existing power dynamics.
Okay, so you've got this volatile situation in the Congo, and you've got Hammarskjöld, this charismatic leader trying to make peace. And then in the middle of the night, his plane goes down.
Yeah.
What do we actually know about the crash itself?
Just after midnight on September 18th, 1961, Hammarskjöld's plane, a DC-6B, crashed near Ndola Airport in Northern Rhodesia, which is now Zambia. He was just a stone's throw from his destination.
So close yet, so far.
Tragically, Hammarskjöld and almost his entire entourage perished. Only one man, a security officer, survived the initial impact but died a few days later.
And this is where things start to get really interesting, or maybe I should say suspicious, because the details surrounding the crash are just strange. Williams points out that the plane had clearance to land, but it ends up crashing miles from the airport. How does that even happen?
It does raise some eyebrows. And then there's the airport manager who, for reasons that are still unclear, decided to close the airport for hours after the crash.
Wait, what? Why would he do that? It's almost like he wanted to keep people away from the crash site.
And as if that wasn't enough, even though there were reports of a bright flash in the sky, the kind you might expect from a plane crash, the search for the wreckage was delayed for a whopping 15 hours.
15 hours. You're telling me nobody put two and two together. It makes you wonder if someone wanted to make sure whatever happened out there stayed hidden. Okay, we've got a mysteriously delayed search, a closed airport, a plane crash, just miles from its destination. It's like a recipe for a conspiracy theory.
Right. Yeah, I could say that.
And of course, multiple investigations were launched to try to get to the bottom of what happened.
Three, to be exact. Three separate investigations.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
Someone was really determined to figure this out. So walk us through them. Who investigated and what did they find?
Well, you had the Rhodesian Civil Aviation Authorities.
Okay.
The Rhodesian Commission, remember, this was still under British colonial rule at the time. And finally, a UN commission was brought in. And get this, none of them could definitively agree on what brought the plane down. Seriously. You have three groups of people all looking at the same evidence, and they can't come to a consensus. Talk about a head-scratcher.
Right.
Yeah.
It really highlights the complexity of the situation. The initial Rhodesian civil aviation investigation was inconclusive. They pointed to the extensive damage to the aircraft and the lack of clear information. Remember, there was only one survivor, and he tragically didn't live long. They couldn't rule out sabotage, but also couldn't definitively say it was the cause. Pilot error was a possibility, but they just couldn't be sure.
Okay, so kind of a dead end. What about the Rhodesian Commission? Did they uncover anything new?
They came to a more definitive conclusion. They ruled it an accident due to pilot error. It seems pretty open and shut.
Right, except for the whole three separate investigations thing. I'm guessing the UN Commission wasn't fully convinced.
Not exactly. Yeah.
They raised some serious concerns about a few things. First, the lack of security at the airport, particularly in Leopoldville, where the plane had been parked before the final leg of the journey. They were worried that someone could have tampered with the plane there.
Oh, interesting. So potentially a bomb or something like that?
That was one of the theories being floated. They also found the delayed search and rescue efforts incredibly suspicious. Remember we were talking about those 15 hours?
Yeah, hard to forget something like that.
Ultimately, they delivered an open verdict. They couldn't rule out an accident, but they also couldn't dismiss the possibility of sabotage or even a deliberate attack.
For our listeners, it's easy to get caught up in the idea of a Cold War assassination plot. It's like something straight out of a spy movie. But there are other explanations, right? I mean, even Williams, who seems pretty convinced this was no accident, dedicates a whole section to this other theory,
Yeah.
CFIT.
Right. CFIT stands for Controlled Flight into Terrain, which sounds complicated but is unfortunately a fairly common cause of plane crashes. Basically, it's when a pilot, for one reason or another, ends up flying a perfectly good aircraft into the ground.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So less of a James Bond thriller, more of a tragic mistake. How does that even happen?
Well, in Hammarskjöld's case, Bengt Rosio, who actually had experience as a diplomat in the Congo himself, put forward the theory that the pilot might have misjudged his altitude because of sensory illusions. You know how sometimes at night or when there's not much visual information, it can be hard to tell how high up you are?
Yeah, like if you're driving in fog and you lose track of the road,
Yeah,
it's disorienting.
exactly. Imagine that. You're flying a plane, it's dark, you're coming in for a landing, maybe there's some fatigue setting in, and suddenly what you think is the runway is actually the ground, much closer than you realize.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But I'm still stuck on the fact that there were all these other strange things happening. The delayed search, the closed airport, CFIT might explain the crash itself, but it doesn't really address any of that, does it?
That's the heart of the mystery, isn't it? Even if we accept CFIT as a plausible explanation for the crash, it doesn't account for all the other inconsistencies. It's like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle where some of the pieces just don't seem to fit.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's where these conspiracy theories come in, right?
Yeah.
Because it's hard to ignore the fact that Hammarskjöld was a man with enemies. He wasn't afraid to shake things up, to challenge the status quo, even if it meant going up against some very powerful people.
Absolutely. Remember what we were saying about his vision for Africa?
Yeah.
That wasn't going over well with everyone. He was pushing for a continent that was truly free from colonial rule, from outside interference. And there were people both in Africa and in the West who had a lot to lose if that happened.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about those whispers of sabotage. Williams mentions this letter published in The Guardian back in 1992. Two former UN officials claiming that the crash was no accident. What's the story there?
Oh, yeah. That letter definitely threw a wrench in the works. It was written by Conor Cruise O'Brien, a well-known Irish diplomat and writer, and George Ivan Smith, who you might remember was Hammarskjöld's personal secretary. These weren't just some random guys. They were there in the thick of it during Hammarskjöld's time at the UN.
So they had inside knowledge, firsthand accounts of what was happening behind the scenes.
Exactly.
What exactly did they say? Did they name names?
They were careful not to point fingers directly, but they were adamant that Hammarskjöld was murdered. They suggested that elements within Western intelligence agencies saw him as a liability, as someone who was getting in the way of their interests in Africa.
Wow. It's one thing to suspect something shady went down, but to have people who were close to Hammarskjöld come out and say it so directly, that's huge. It makes you think about the bigger picture here. What were the consequences of Hammarskjöld's death? Who benefited from his absence on the world stage?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
His death created a void in the UN, a lack of leadership at a time when the world desperately needed it. And unfortunately, some of the conflicts he was working so hard to resolve, like the one in the Congo, those only escalated in the years that followed. It's impossible to say for sure what would have happened if he had lived, but it's hard to imagine things wouldn't have been different.
It's a sobering thought. You have this visionary leader, someone who's genuinely trying to make the world a better place, and he's taken out, whether by accident or by design. It makes you realize how fragile peace can be, how easily things can spiral out of control.
And it highlights the importance of truth, of accountability. Even though it's been over 60 years since Hammarskjöld's death, we still don't have definitive answers. And that's why books like Susan Williams are so important, because they keep these questions alive. They force us to confront the uncomfortable truths of history.
So where does that leave us? We've got a plane crash, shrouded in mystery, conflicting investigations, whispers of sabotage, and a Cold War backdrop that just adds another layer of intrigue. It's a lot to process.
It certainly is. And I think the biggest takeaway here isn't about finding a definitive answer, a smoking gun. It's about understanding the complexity of the situation, the different forces at play, and the importance of continuing to ask questions.
Exactly. It's about looking beyond the surface, digging deeper, even if it means uncovering some uncomfortable truths along the way. And on that note, I want to leave our listeners with this. What do you think happened to Dag Hammarskjöld? Was it a tragic accident, a series of unfortunate events? Or was it something more sinister? Pick up Susan Williams' book, Who Killed Hammarskjöld? Dive into the evidence and decide for yourself, because sometimes the search for the truth is just as important as the truth itself.